on parade, but they are socially distanced. They are wearing masks and standing 2 meters apart. Coming off the plane now, the headdress of Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, a naval officer who was killed in the crash. Of Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, a young naval officer who tragically lost his life in the crash, making their way over to the hearse that will carry their loved one's body back to Toronto. Except for in this case, there is not a body, there is only a headdress, there is only a pillow, making it that much more difficult to say goodbye. We do know that the remains of one of the other members of the military killed in the crash have been found, but they've not managed to identify at this point who that individual is. And you can see the families there struggling to say goodbye. They have roses that they are laying next to that headdress. And the incredible difficulty of knowing that some of these families will never have their loved one back to place them in a place of final rest where they can visit them. So very, very difficult emotionally for these families to do this in this way. And this was a familiar scene to us throughout Afghanistan, with so many Canadians coming back home very sadly draped in the flag. I struggle to remember another incident where we have seen only the headdress and the incredible agony for these families. Many of those who died in the crash attended Royal Military College. They served with many who were also Royal Military College, some of them in relationships and partners from Royal Military College. So this has had a very dramatic effect on that of the military community in particular. I've spoken to a number of officers who went to school with them, who remember their partners. This is just absolutely devastating to have such a large number of people killed from such a very small segment of the military, and incredibly difficult for their colleagues who were on board the HMCS Fredericton, who we now know a number of them witnessed the crash of the helicopter, and the hope is that they will be able to provide information that might help to figure out what happened with what they saw. This is a very large helicopter. You can see it from a ways off. It was within a 2-mile radius of the ship when it plunged out of the sky and into the ocean, and the investigators will be interviewing those who witnessed that to see what they can tell them about it. But right now I see we have the next pillow and headdress coming off of the plane. This is the headdress of Master Corporal Matthew Cousins, the only non-commissioned officer who was on board. The rest were officers. Somebody who had a tremendous amount of experience and a tremendous amount of respect inside the military. And we're seeing now the family of Master Corporal Cousins approaching the hearse, which will drive the pillow with his headdress back to Toronto down the Highway of Heroes. Master Corporal Cousins, by far the most experienced member of the crew who was on board that day. He actually joined the military back in 1994 in the infantry. He later became Air Force, where he began his career there as an airborne electronics sensor operator. That was back in 2013. So this was certainly somebody who knew his way around aircraft electronics. He earned his wings in 2015. He was then posted to a maritime helicopter squadron, 423 Squadron, and he qualified there on both the old CH-124 Sea Kings, which a lot of our viewers will remember, and of course the new aircraft, the new helicopter, the CH-148 Cyclone. That was only brought into service by the Canadian Forces in the last couple of years. It's very recent. He was on board that, of course, when it crashed. We don't know what happened there. We do know that the military has the voice recorder. They also have the black box, and that might help them put together some of what happened. This was not the first deployment for Master Corporal Cousins. He had previously been involved in deployments of the HMCS Charlottetown on Operation Reassurance, the same one he was on, which is this deterrence operation against Russia, NATO operation. And then, of course, he deployed again with HMCS Fredericton in 2020. He was the NCO aboard the Stalker, which was the call sign for this helicopter when it went down.
You are?
A scene of indescribable grief there, of the 6 hearses waiting to take both the remains and the memories and the headdresses of those who are fallen. What we're seeing right now is the quarter guard marching off of the parade square. The hearse doors have now been closed to prepare for their departure, and at this point the families will now be escorted to individual limousines that will take them to Toronto along the Highway Heroes, behind the bodies and the memories and the headdresses of their loved ones. And if you talk to family members of any of the fallen who've experienced this before, this is a day that is both a blur and forever etched in their minds. The surrealness of realizing that they have lost a family member in this way, the challenge for these families of having to deal with this in COVID-19 when they cannot have a normal service, when they cannot have a normal grieving process, when they are forced to wear black masks, and many there have gloves on as well, and practice social distancing. And on top of all that, the questions. It's not clear why or how their loved ones died beyond a helicopter crash. And that is something that the Canadian Forces is working to get answers on. But the incredible difficulty of not only losing someone, but not knowing why it happened or how it happened. And those will be a significant focus in the coming days for the military. For now, the helicopter that was involved in this, and the entire fleet of helicopters, rather, that were involved in this, have taken what the Chief of the Defense Staff, General Jonathan Vance, has called an operational pause. They are not officially grounded, but they are trying to determine whether this was a singular accident or if there is some kind of systemic problem on board those helicopters. They are unusual helicopters in that they are very, very large and very modern. The previous helicopters, if you talk to pilots, they'll tell you that they flew them by pushing, controls that essentially were attached to big metal rods and moved mechanical components. This new Cyclone is much more electronic. It's what they call a fly-by-wire helicopter, which means essentially it's all based on signals. So they're not literally moving parts of the helicopter when they move their controls around. They are signaling it. It has a triple control system on board. It is supposed to have tremendous amounts of redundancy because it's so modern to prevent a crash. So the question here will be, what happened? Was it mechanical? Was it weather? Was it personnel? The military have said at this point they do not believe that it was contact from any kind of an enemy force. But that is really all that they've ruled out. We don't have a sense beyond that of what might have happened here. So a lot of questions for these families still to come in coming days. And I know that we will have more here as well on Global for you as these hearses make their way to Toronto along a much more empty than usual highway of heroes, as people have been asked to stay away because of social distancing, but many will be watching online. And I think these families will feel the support of Canadians. And we're just watching now Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, both of whom were there for the repatriation of these Canadians to their home soil. The Prime Minister does not regularly or always attend these. Protocol states that it's in fact the Governor General a lot of the time, but obviously given the significance of the number of people who were killed in this crash, not surprising that the Prime Minister himself was there. That's why he didn't give a press conference today. He was on his way to CFB Trenton. And you can see there the members on parade, 2 meters apart, wearing black masks to try to keep this as safe as possible while still providing a dignified repatriation ceremony. You can see the Prime Minister pausing there. That's the Chief of the Defense Staff with all the braids on him, who's just in front of the Prime Minister, General Jonathan Vance. And I've talked to him about this crash, and he has told me they are doing everything possible to look into it. At this point, they really don't know what happened, and the immediate focus is on trying to provide support for these families who are absolutely devastated by what has happened. There's one commonality you'll hear when you talk to the families, and that is that the loved one who they lost died doing what they loved. It's not something any family ever wants or ever expects, but it is something that they know they were passionate and truly believed in their service to Canada. And I believe what they're waiting for here is for the families to depart. And you can see there the vehicles that will be carrying the families with the Canadian flags on them. Those black limousines that were so familiar to us were in Afghanistan. Back out again today. And I know all of us at Global News are thinking of these families today, and our hearts go out to them and to all who served with these very brave men and women. And it's a very hard thing to watch, no matter how many of these you've covered, and I've covered a lot. We don't have a sense of how long it's going to take before the military decides whether or not the rest of the Cyclone fleet is safe to fly. These are helicopters that replaced the ancient Sea Kings that lots of people will remember. They were notoriously old. These helicopters were slow in coming into service. They did have to take a pause during the trial at one point, but senior military members insist that they believe they're very safe. They were very surprised by this crash. So again, we will have to wait and see exactly what happened that caused this terrible tragedy, and whether whatever that was can be prevented from happening again. For the HMCS Fredericton crew, who are still very far from home, a very difficult time indeed. Usually we would see Canadians outside the fence waving in support of the families. Obviously today, not the case in the same way, and I think part of perhaps what compelled the Prime Minister to go to show that support to the families, that they certainly are felt by Canadians, but are not necessarily able to see them physically at this point. And as we've been saying, just so difficult to not only not have the remains of all of your loved ones there to be able to say goodbye and bring that closure, but also not able to have the kind of services you would normally have, the kind of comfort, people coming to their homes with food and support, to hug them, to hold their hand. You can't do any of that during COVID-19. Although they have been assigned military support officers, which is typical after somebody falls in the military in the line of service, they are able to be there and be present with them for support. But tremendously challenging, and then to go down the highway of heroes, and I'm sure you'll see some supporters out there, but people trying to be careful and physically distance and observe all the rules. It just seems so tragically unfair for these families that not only have they lost their loved ones, they've lost them in a time that has denied them the right to grieve with the nation in the way that they typically would be given. So I know that this is very hard from people I've spoken to who are in touch with the families and who know them, and so many so young too. Only having graduated within the last few years for some of these officers who were on board. Very young people with their whole life in front of them and tremendous potential, nobody expecting it to be cut short so quickly, so sharply, so unexpectedly. And you can see now that they are moving into the hearses, preparing to leave. All of this is very carefully planned, down to the last second, down to the last moment. It is military precision to honor the fallen and to make sure that everybody is moving in lockstep, that you have that incredibly somber environment and that precision that represents the precision they carried out through so much of their careers as military officers, as well as Master Corporal Cousins, who was a non-commissioned officer. CFB Trenton has seen, sadly, many of these ceremonies over the years, although they've slowed down substantially now that we are much less involved in an active war zone. That said, we do have Canadian Armed Forces troops deployed around the world, in Latvia, as you've seen, in the Mediterranean, as well as in other parts of the Balkans, in Iraq. and Canadian Special Operations continue to operate quietly in many other areas beyond that. So we don't talk that much right now about the deployments because they don't tend to be in active combat, but they are certainly there. And every day that people serve in the military, there is the potential that they could be killed. Whether that is in a training exercise, and training, by the way, is inherently dangerous. That there's a reason why the military trains the way that it does. It's because it has to be realistic for when these members of the military find themselves in battle. They have to be prepared for that. But that means there is a level of risk. There is a level of potential for things to happen that you just simply cannot anticipate. But they are very highly trained in general. And this also hits the pilot community very hard, if I can just speak to that for a moment. There's not a lot of pilots left in the Canadian Armed Forces. There's a tremendous shortage. So to lose this many at one time, incredibly painful for that community, and a reminder of the challenges that the Canadian Armed Forces is facing. A number of folks have come home because of COVID-19. The military has tried to bring home some people who they can, but others who are deemed essential to ongoing operations or deterrence do have to remain overseas. HMCS Fredericton was among that, and likely thought that they were safe from COVID-19 because they're aboard a ship in the middle of the Ionian Sea. But again, it is this reminder that there is always a risk to military service, and these families bear a tremendous sacrifice and a tremendous amount of courage, that even when they are away on missions that we don't tend to think of as dangerous, you never know when your loved one may or may not come home. And that is a tremendous sacrifice that military families make as they support each other while that person is gone. Mom, dad, son, daughter, overseas. Very, very difficult. And there is a constant stressor there that most of us just don't think about as civilians because we don't have to worry about that. So a reminder that the sacrifice is very much made by the members, but it's also very much made by those military families who do incredible work for the country under very difficult circumstances, and often, especially now that Afghanistan has wound down, with frankly very little recognition of how challenging it is to do what they do. You see the families that we just saw walking out of the hangar. They were there with the honor guard preparing to get into the vehicles to travel back and to try to find a way to make sense of what has happened here and to make sense of what is an extraordinary challenge for any family to take in. And certainly for all those aboard the ship who have lost 6 of their colleagues. And just for our viewers who are watching this and wondering who exactly was on board that helicopter, there were 3 Air Force officers There was one Air Force non-commissioned member, and there was also 2 Navy officers, 2 sub-lieutenants. We're not sure why they were on the helicopter. They're not typically a part of the crew, but it's not unusual for a ship's captain to have young officers get on board the helicopter or to go out with any number of components of that ship's crew to really learn and understand what they do and how they do it, so that in the future they will understand when they are in command what happens on different parts of the ship. So we don't know why exactly those 2 young naval officers were on board the day that this helicopter went down. Now, one of the most difficult things watching these is always the little ones who are there to say goodbye, who don't understand what's happening yet, but will likely remember this day. And the incredible challenge for the families of managing their own grief, and in many cases also having to manage children who are left behind. You can see there the line of dignitaries who are waiting as these families go out to pay them tribute by standing there and honoring them as they make their way to the vehicles, including the Prime Minister himself, the Chief of the Defense Staff, Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan, all standing there. I believe the Chief of the Maritime Staff is there as well, and likely the Chief of the Air Staff, considering this was a crash that killed both Navy and Air Force personnel. And this is just the beginning for so many of these families of trying to deal with the consequences of what has happened. I've stayed in touch over the years with many military families who have lost a loved one, and that sense of the hole in their heart just never really disappears. And it helps in many cases that they're able to know that their loved one was doing something they were so passionate about, that they had committed themselves to a life that is bigger than themselves, a life of service to the country. But it still never takes away the pain of losing somebody. And especially when so many of the fallen in this were so precious to everyone in their lives. A Master Corporal who was a father to 2 children. Others so young and just starting out, and now their lives and all that promise cut short, which is not to say they will not be remembered and they will not be honored, but tremendously difficult for the families who suddenly find themselves adrift without people who they fully expected to come home off of this mission in a few months, safe and sound, to rejoin them here. We don't know how long it will take for the military to conduct their investigation into what happened, but that too will help to bring closure, as well as questions about what needs to be done, if there's anything that can be done, to ensure the safety of other crews who are aboard these helicopters, because keep in mind, they are on board all Canadian frigates. So anything that's a city class, like the HMCS Calgary, the HMCS Vancouver, they all would have this helicopter aboard when they deploy. And we're just seeing now that the hearses are very slowly beginning to pull out, carrying the remains of some of the crew, carrying the headdresses of those who could not be recovered. And there they go. They're pulling out of CFB Trenton. They will pull onto the Highway of Heroes. They are heading to the coroner's office. Typically, all of the bodies of the fallen will be taken there. In this case, they don't have all of the bodies of the fallen. But those which they do, which is Sub-Lieutenant Cobra, will be taken there. And you can see the police escorts for the families as well as they prepare to follow the bodies or the headdress of their loved ones. And you can also see that we just saw all of those dignitaries saluting in the back.
Good journalism isn't
Somebody's head! Somebody's head!